All right, now on to an issue that's been plaguing museums around the world. The question of rightful ownership. It's just surfaced again. WGBH News arts editor Jared Bowen joins us, and he's got the very latest. Hi, Jared.
Hi, Kim. For years, a collection of Nigerian antiquities has been a treasured part of the Museum of Fine Arts' African art holdings. But late last week, the MFA announced it has returned 8 of those pieces to Nigeria, including 2 artifacts roughly 2,000 years old. After a year and a half of research, the MFA determined the pieces had been removed from Nigeria illegally. I'm joined now by Victoria Reed. She's the MFA's lead detective, otherwise known as curator for provenance. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now you're kind of like the reverse Indiana Jones, actually. You're giving art back, but yeah. So take us back a little bit. This was gifted to the MFA by a family, and yes. You have made it clear that the family who gifted it to the MFA, they were very generous over the years. This was, they had no way of knowing that this was looted art.
Right.
But what was the tip-off point for you?
Well, this was part of a much bigger project. They left us a bequest of over 300 objects. So we had to go through object by object and consider each object, whether it was exported legally, imported legally, whether we could take title, whether we could take good legal ownership to each of the objects. So these 8, in that process, considering Nigerian legislation, what we knew about where they had been, jumped out.
So what are your methods for research? I mean, you must be, it's sort of forensic investigation to some degree, I would imagine, because you're going through documents, and how far back do these documents go?
In this case, not very far. And these should have had a much older paper trail, considering the types of objects that they are. They're archaeological material, they're antiquities. All of them left Nigeria very recently. They're the kind of objects that would have been governed by Nigerian legislation, and nobody ever authorized their export.
So what becomes the red flags? What stands out to you where you realize that there is not a good, healthy chain of custody here?
Well, there were no export documents for these objects. There was one that purported to have an export document, which turned out not to be legitimate. A couple of the objects in this group of 8 were part of collections that and were probably stolen. So in other words, we have a paper trail up to a certain date, and then there's a kind of suspicious gap, and then the objects reappear on the art market.
We often hear about this, we've heard about so much about this with Nazi looted art, but of course that was 60, 70 years ago, but this was only around the 70s from what I understand that this was actually happening.
And even later.
So to what degree does this remain a problem if this was happening only 30 years ago still?
I think it remains a problem, and the art market is not always terribly well regulated. These works of art were not legitimate, they were not legally on the market, and yet they were in the hands of well-known dealers and ended up in a private collection. So it really, I think, behooves everyone who's participating in the art market to do their due diligence, to ask questions and not simply accept the information that they're given at face value.
But how much does the region come into play? Does it matter that it was Africa? Because I understand one of these pieces literally walked out, well, not literally, can't walk out of a museum, but was taken right out of a museum.
Yes.
Are there regions of the world that are now targeted?
Targeted for looting? I think so, certainly, and in areas, particularly where there's areas of conflict. For example, we're seeing looting going on right now in Syria. So again, I think education is important, letting people who are participating in the art market know that that there are objects on the market that are at high risk for theft and looting, and to make sure that you have the paper trail that you need.
And I know that your job at the MFA is the detective work, but how much of this becomes problematic for museums who want to take in these collections but know that they're accepting a headache possibly when they're doing it? Right.
Well, in this case, we couldn't take these because we couldn't legally own them, and we worked. This was part of a bequest, and we worked with the estate, and we make sure that they would go back to their rightful owners. So it was a bit of work. It took about a year and a half to go through all 300 and some objects, but ultimately there was no way we could bring these into the collection. That would have been a much greater headache, believe me.
And you're a rarity, from what I understand, that a lot of museums, most perhaps, don't have a position such as yours. I know that there have been complaints that other institutions are just putting pictures on their website, and that's sort of their safeguard. But is the MFA really the exception in terms of what you're doing? We
are trying to be proactive, and I think what's unique about the position at the MFA is that I work with each curatorial department on provenance issues. So I'm not working just on Nazi-era provenance issues, I'm working with each department on any number of ownership issues that could arise. And we do try to be proactive, and in this case we recognized things that we couldn't legally own, and we reached out to the authorities in Nigeria.
The museum has more than 450,000 artifacts. And they all came from somewhere, most not from the United States. So what is the process to go through all of those objects?
It's not as systematic as I would like, because as you say, just the scope is huge. So I work through the collection as I'm able, sort of group by group. And in particular, I work on everything that comes into the building before we decide to make it a part of the collection. So we are trying to be forward-looking in that way. We certainly don't want 20 years from now to realize that something we acquired in 2014 was stolen. So I'm both looking backwards at everything that's already in the collection that's been there since the 19th century, as well as everything that we're considering making a part of the collection.
It's interesting, too, that even, I know that you've spoken about dealers don't necessarily know that the pieces that are coming into their shops and into their businesses are looted from different regions of the world. I find that kind of surprising. You'd think that they would be a little bit more skeptical. You can understand an individual, but it's surprising that dealers don't have the safeguards.
I can't really speak to what each of these dealers knew or didn't know, but what I think it demonstrates is that if you are buying and selling artwork, you do need to do your due diligence. It is the responsibility of the buyer to understand what risks may be involved with taking this property on.
And quickly, when you reached out to the other side, to Nigeria, did they know immediately that these pieces had been in the country and were taken out?
They responded very swiftly and said that they had not authorized the export and that they would like them repatriated.
All right, well, Tori Reed, it's fascinating. Now they're safely back in Nigeria.
They're back in Nigeria. I believe they're at the National Museum in Lagos.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.